So this presentation will provide a high-level overview of the study methodology used by the Minnesota Department of Transportation Aeronautics for the 2019 statewide airport economic impact study. The 2019 study, which includes 126 study airports, 118 of which are general aviation airports, and 8 are commercial airports, not including the Metropolitan Airports Commission airports. Those 126 airports are worth an estimated $1.6 billion in annual economic activity. Now, that number on its own may not mean much to you, but the point of this presentation is to put some process behind that and define the terms and methodology used to create that number. So the airports and airport stakeholders can better defend and understand and promote these figures. So some common questions and possibly criticisms that economic impact studies encounter, especially related to airports, are, I can't believe the airport supports this much benefit. The airport really supports $2.5 million in annual economic activity. There aren't 20 people working at the airport. I've been there. I've seen this airport. There aren't that many people there. Well, these are all legitimate questions that we will work on addressing here through the course of this presentation. So there's two parts to today's training. Today's training covers the process used to estimate economic impacts. Part 2, which will be a separate presentation or recording, covers the economic impact tool that was developed as part of this study that allows the user, an airport or anybody interested in the airport, to update the baseline economic impacts that go into the estimate of economic impact for each airport. So just a quick agenda for the part 1 of this training. We have 5 economic impact categories that are the activity centers or sources of economic impact that we seek out on airports and seek to measure. And what are the units of measure? Our measurements are the study outputs used to estimate the economic impacts. Those are jobs or employment, payroll, and spending. We will cover the process used to estimate economic impacts in each category. The methodology follows an FAA-approved process. And we will also provide examples for each economic impact calculation by each of the aforementioned categories and measurements. Excuse me. When talking about sources of activity, what are the things that drive the economic impact on an airport? Well, we look for 5 activity areas, or what we call categories of economic impact. The first is airport management. These are the jobs related to the airport sponsor, the airport manager, the entity that runs the airport. There are jobs on and off airport that are responsible for making the day-to-day operations of an airport run smoothly. There are also on-airport business tenants. Not every airport has business tenants, but many do. This is typically the largest component of the economic impact for an airport. Business tenants can be an FBO, aircraft maintenance shop, a concessions entity. It can also be governmental agencies such as Department of Natural Resources, the Federal Aviation Administration, and several others. So we seek to count those on-airport aviation-related jobs. The third category of economic impact is average annual capital investment. These are the construction or design projects that airports undertake to develop their airports and build out their infrastructure. This spending related to capital investment creates jobs during the design, planning, and construction phases of each project. The fourth category we consider is general aviation visitor spending. Visitors come to all parts of Minnesota through the local airports using general aviation aircraft, and these visitors spend money in the local economy. This study estimated over 230,000 general aviation visitors arrived through the 126 study airports. Commercial visitor spending is the fifth and another significant component of the economic impact for the state study. However, this only occurs at the eight airports that have commercial airline service. So there are upwards of 5 categories that are the drivers of economic impact at each airport, but not every airport is going to have all 5. Not every airport has tenants, not every airport is a commercial service airport. So typically 3 categories, upwards of 5, drive the economic impact number at each airport. So what are the units of measure that we use to quantify the economic impacts? First, we start with the employment. These are the jobs that are on airport, working at the airport, or directly related to airport activities. Then we quantify the payroll on an annual basis associated with these jobs, and the spending that occurs by airports. These are the operating expenses to run an airport. The business tenants that operate on an airport also have operating expenses. These are the numbers we seek to capture. Capital investment and general aviation visitor spending is also captured, measured by annual spending. And of course, annual economic activity that may be a new and different or unknown measurement, but that is simply the combination of payroll plus spending. So think of payroll plus spending as the dollars going into the Minnesota state economy in local communities and throughout the state. Dollars going into the economy as a direct result of airport jobs and jobs related to airport activities. So first we need to establish the direct economic impact. So these are, as we mentioned, the on-airport activities or activities directly related to on-airport activity. The process to identify these direct impacts for airport management and business tenants comes from surveys and interviews conducted with each airport manager and with each business tenant located on an airport. Oftentimes there are many businesses on an airport. Each business was surveyed to collect the 3 primary measurements you see on screen: the direct employment, direct payroll, and direct spending. So for airport management and business tenants, our survey effort gives us the 3 primary measurements that we use to quantify economic impacts. For average annual capital investment and annual visitor spending, which includes both general aviation visitors and commercial service visitors, we can identify through our survey efforts the total spending that occurs at each airport. But we need some help to identify employment and payroll. So that's where the in-plan model comes in handy. And the in-plan model, it was developed by a local Minnesota firm to assess the impact of new businesses coming into a local economy, or it's often used for identifying the impact of building a new sports stadium. But it runs on census and demographic data, also from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, to identify, based on certain inputs, when a job arrives or when spending occurs, what are the ripple effects in the local economy, and what are the impacts associated both on a direct component and also the ripple effects that occur throughout the economy. So for those 3 other categories, we need some help from in-plan, the in-plan model. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the economic impact categories, the first being airport management. So this is just the lead into our economic impact categories, and we're going to start with management. So some things to know about airport management direct impacts. As we touched on a little bit earlier, airport management impacts can be on airport or off airport. Many times a small airport will have, owned by the city or county, will have people at the city or county level spending a portion of their day-to-day jobs involved in airport affairs. Well, we do want to capture that off-airport activity. That could be an HR person, someone in legal department, accounting, operations or maintenance, grants management. Even if there aren't on-airport employees, there is likely an off-airport component to the airport management category that we do seek to quantify. So we asked the airport manager whether they're on or off airport to provide their direct impacts, which are employment, payroll, and spending. Operating expenses, the spending it usually includes insurance, utilities, supplies, and other spending to support its day-to-day operation of the airport. And it's important to note that the spending number does not include payroll or any local match for state or federal grants. Those expenditures are accounted for in their own silos. So here we have a quick example of how we calculate direct airport management impacts. So this example airport has 2.5 on-airport employees and 1.5 off-airport employees, and that 1.5 could be made of one full-time, one part-time, or it could be a variety of quarter employees dedicated to airport business. But ultimately, the net is 4 full-time employees. We have identified here at this sample airport $140,000 worth of combined payroll for all of those 4 employees. $60,000 is the direct spending to purchase supplies and operate the airport. And as we discussed, the direct annual economic activity is the combination of direct payroll plus spending. So $200,000 is the result of $140,000 in payroll plus $60,000 in spending. Those are our economic impact measures associated with the airport management category. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into airport business tenants. Airport business tenants are on-airport companies and organizations with paid employees that provide aviation-related services directly to aircraft or to airport customers. Important considerations are that we are not considering off-airport businesses if they are aviation-related. There's many aerospace companies that exist off airports. Those were not counted in this study. We're only considering on-airport aviation-related businesses. And along those lines, if there's an on-airport entity that has no aviation component, they are not counted in this study. So again, not all study airports have business tenants. However, business tenants are the largest driver of the overall economic impact for the statewide totals. There were over 280 individual business tenants identified across the 126 airports, and every business tenant identified, all of those 280, were asked to provide their direct employment, payroll, and spending. We got employment from every business, 100% of those 280 businesses. However, this is proprietary information. Not all businesses are eager to just hand out their total payroll and spending figures. A lot of that is competitive information, and it's private. These are private entities. They're not eager to give this stuff out. So in those cases, we have group averages by tenant type to help us fill in the blanks. So if we know the employment, we have averages specific to Minnesota and nationwide averages that help us come up with very reasonable spending per employee and payroll per employee. So we can fill in the holes that way, so long as we know the direct employment for every tenant, which we do. Here we have a quick example of direct annual airport business tenants. So in this example, we have 3 tenants. The first tenant has 2 employees, second has 1, the third has 5, for a total of 8 employees, a total of $304,000 in payroll, $200,000 in direct spending for all 3 tenants, and that combines for a direct annual economic activity of $504,000. Now keep in mind that no individual tenant data will be shown anywhere in the study. In this particular table you see on the screen, we see tenant 1, 2, 3, and all of their payroll and spending information. This is just for illustrative purposes only. In reality, in all of the reporting and documentation, what you will see is the top level roll-up of all the information. So you'll see 8, 304, 200, and 504,000 for this example airport. The next economic impact category is average annual capital investment. So the first thing the first step to collect this data is we ask MnDOT for 5 years worth of grant history data. This gives us project details for each specific airport by project type, the specific year, and the total funding dollars broken out even by funding source, so state, local, and federal matching dollars. However, we're really only interested in the total amount spent because that total amount, regardless of the source, is what drives the employment and associated payroll. So we take the MnDOT data and we combine it with any local-only spending that has occurred on the airport. MnDOT wouldn't know if an airport invested in a capital project completely on their own without the assistance of a grant project. So we asked the airports what they spent on their own. We also asked each of the business tenants if they've invested in major capital projects over the last 5 years, and we include that information. There's a lot of nice FBOs in the state of Minnesota at airports, and if that falls within our 2013 to 2018 window that we're seeking to get capital investments, those FBOs would have provided the spending dollars or the capital dollars that would have gone into enhancing that FBO. So we take the total spend over a 5-year period and average it out to a 5-year average. This helps us do several things. First of all, it smooths out the fluctuations in spending from year to year. It also, for small airports often don't have spending in a given year. So by opening the window to a 5-year time span, we are able to capture, offering the ability to capture a greater number of projects for small airports that don't frequently have spending projects, capital projects. For large airports with major multi-year projects, using a 5-year average helps us capture multiple years of that average. Instead of just picking 2018, that may include a portion of the spending for a multi-year, possibly a 3-year project. So by casting a wider net for capital projects, we're helping to include more, but we average it out so it smooths out the fluctuations from year to year. Again, keep in mind that the impacts from capital investments are only realized during the planning, design, permitting, and construction phases. So if a $5 million project, for example, occurred during the 2013-2018 5-year window that we are asking for capital projects, let's say that $5 million project was a runway extension at a relatively small airport, it's very unlikely that another $5 million project will have occurred the next time an economic impact study would be conducted, which would include a different time frame, possibly, let's say, 2024 to 2029. So capital investments, this impact category has the highest propensity to fluctuate from year to year. So that really reiterates the snapshot in time nature of economic impact studies, and in particular with capital investment within that category. So this slide we have an example of, we're going to work through the math of how to determine impacts, economic impacts, and the measures for this economic impact category, which is capital investments. So we've asked this airport, we've asked the manager, we've asked the tenants for 5 years worth of capital investment data, and the 5-year average is $610,000. So now if you notice, that's our direct annual economic activity, because if you think about capital investment spending, when a project is done at an airport, the dollars that it takes, the cost that it takes to develop a project covers both the labor cost and the material cost for equipment and machinery and other supplies that go into implementing the project. So really, direct annual economic activity includes the payroll and spending. So we know the big ending answer. So in this case, we need to work backwards. So that's where in-plan comes in. We know our direct annual economic activity. In-plan gives us a jobs per million conversion ratio. The example here, this is not the actual ratio used in the study, but for every every $1 million in direct annual economic activity, 10 jobs are created. This is an example. So for $610,000 in direct annual economic activity, 6 full-time jobs are created as a result of this spending. So now we know the last item of our 4 measures, and we know the first one, 6 employees and $600,000 in annual economic activity. We use Bureau of Labor and Statistic data specific to Minnesota and related to architects, civil engineers, drafters, planners. We come up with an average salary for that type of job that would be involved in construction activity. And in this example, it's $55,000. So we take $55,000, multiply it by the 6 jobs that we've identified, and now we know direct payroll, which is $330,000. And since we know direct annual economic activity is the sum of payroll and spending, we take direct annual economic activity and subtract the payroll to determine direct spending of $280,000. So the 4th economic impact category is general aviation visitor spending. So some things to know about general aviation visitors. At any airport, general aviation operations are classified one of 2 ways. They're either local operations or they are itinerant operations. Local operations occur within visual sight of the airport. So itinerant operations are, if we're looking to capture visitor expenditures, we need to focus our attention on itinerant operations. However, itinerant operations includes both operations performed by aircraft based at our subject airport and also visiting aircraft based further away, also known as transient aircraft. So the transient aircraft or visiting aircraft is what we need to focus on to identify the number of general aviation visitors. The general aviation visitors, as we touched on briefly before, we're interested in visitors because they come through the airport and visit local businesses, or perhaps it's a leisure trip. They do recreational activities. Along the way, they're spending money in the local economy and in the state of Minnesota on lodging, food, ground transportation, recreation, retail, entertainment, and other various things. So this spending drives jobs in the local economy. And we're seeking to identify that spending. Now the formula, the last bullet you see on the screen here, the formula to identify our general aviation visitor spending is annual general aviation visitors multiplied by average spending per visitor. Now, we don't know the first 2 components of that equation. We don't know how many visitors visit an airport on an annual basis, and we don't know spending per visitor. We can't just have the manager tell us. There's no existing source out there that can provide this data to us. So we need to estimate it. To estimate general aviation visitors, in our initial survey process that we distributed surveys to airport managers and FBOs on airports who are familiar with aircraft operations and the nature of those aircraft operations. The same surveys that asked for their employment, payroll, and spending also asked managers and FBOs how many weekly aircraft arrivals there are. What's a typical week? Not your peak week, not your least busy week, but what's a typical week of how many aircraft visiting aircraft land at your airport? That's the first piece of it. We also ask, of those weekly visiting aircraft arrivals, what's the fleet mix? So what types of aircraft are they? The categories are how many single engine, multi-engine, or jets. And of that fleet mix, how many average visitors by aircraft type are on each of those aircraft? So how many people could potentially be arriving through your airport and be spending money in the local economy? So this process follows AOPA guidelines, Airport Owners and Pilots Association. They developed this process to estimate general aviation visitors. Again, there's no source we can go to that could provide this data to us. So we have to estimate it using reasonable estimates, and of course we bounce those estimates that we come up with off of MnDOT. We test those for both they pass a smell test. Do they pass a smell test by both MnDOT, and we give them back to the study airports to make sure nothing is absurdly high or low or outside of the realm of reason. So now we have the ability to estimate our annual general aviation visitors. Now the other piece of that equation, if you recall from the previous slide, is what does each visitor spend? Well, we develop averages, average spending per visitor based on surveys that we've deployed to each airport. All of the 126 airports received a pad of surveys, and airports and FBOs were asked to distribute the surveys to departing passengers. And the survey asked, if you're a visitor, what did you spend while you were here in the local area? It asked, what was the purpose of your trip? How long were you here? And how much did you spend for lodging, ground transportation, food and beverage, etc., so on and so forth. Now, this is we build these estimates from the ground up. Each airport has their own unique estimate. For airports that didn't produce a lot of surveys, and that's certainly the case with a lot of small airports, we group them into similar size and market serving airports that did produce significant sample size of surveys. And of course, an airport with the nature of the visitor can also drive the average spend per visitor. Think about an airport with a higher percentage of day-only visitor, a visitor that would come in and depart all in the same day and not spend a night. In general, they spend less because they don't have lodging. They're not eating as many meals in the local economy. So an airport with a higher percentage of day-only visitors versus overnight visitors would have a lower spending per visitor average. So there's a variety of factors that drive our general aviation visitor spending. So now we know kind of the background of how we get the data to come up with the estimates. This slide will walk you through the math to each of those steps to come up with our annual general aviation visitors. So we start by asking the airport and FBO, how many weekly aircraft arrivals? In this example, we have 10. Well, what's the makeup of those 10 weekly aircraft arrivals? We have 2 jets, 3 twins, and 5 single-engine aircraft. How many people are on each of those planes? And this is a unique thing to each airport provided by FBOs and the managers, people at those airports. In this example, 5 people per jet, 3 per twin, and 2 per single-engine aircraft. So we do the math. 10 weekly visiting aircraft on an annual basis, that works out to 520 annual visiting general aviation aircraft arrivals. And we distribute the fleet mix across the 20% that were jets, 30% that were twins, and 50% that were singles to get the number of arrivals by each aircraft type. And then we multiply the estimated number of visitors per aircraft type to get total annual visitors by aircraft type. And then when we add each of those components up, 520 plus 468 plus 520, we get 1,508 general aviation visitors on an annual basis. So that's the first component to our equation of estimating general aviation visitor spend. And as we discussed, the second component, which is general aviation spend per visitor, the average spend per visitor, that's derived from visitor surveys. Now that we have those two components, number of visitors, average spend per visitor, now we do the math to identify total annual general aviation visitor spending. So on the screen we see 1,500 total visitors. Half are day-only visitors, and the other half stay for one night or more. The day-only visitors have a per visitor average spend of $40. So that works out to $30,000 in annual direct spending. The other half, who spend at least one night, have a significantly higher spend per visitor of $230 in this example. So the 754 overnight visitors times $230 works out to $173,000 in annual direct spending. Combined $173,000 plus $30,000 and that works out to $203,580 in direct annual general aviation visitor spending. So now we know our spending number. That's just one piece of the four measures that we seek to identify for this economic impact category. Similar to what we did for capital investment, we need to work backwards. We know the big number. We know the big spending number, annual economic activity, that covers the spending and payroll. So think about this general aviation visitor spending. This spending is produced by visitors who visit the local economy and spend at merchants such as hotels, restaurants, rental car agencies, and other things. And that spending covers both the payroll of the staff at those merchants and the operating costs for each of those merchants to purchase supplies and cover the overhead for the facility or the insurance or the general maintenance that goes into that merchant. So again, direct annual economic activity, we know that it includes payroll and spending. We need to work backwards. This is where we lean on in-plan, which provides us our conversion ratio, jobs per million number of, for every $1 million in direct annual economic activity. In this case, which again is just an example for this presentation, is 14 direct jobs. So $203,000 supports 3 full-time jobs. So now we know 2 components to our 4 measures that we're seeking to identify. Now, we rely on in-plan and Bureau of Labor and Statistics data to come up with a solid average for hospitality, or average salary for a hospitality worker, retail worker, restaurant workers, a lot of things in the service industry. So our average in this example is $28,000 per year. Now that's a little bit lower than a construction worker, which than what we used in the capital investment category, which is made up of engineers, drafters, architects, planners, and so forth. So the conversion ratio per $1 million is a little bit higher here. More jobs can be created in this category, the visitor spending category, because of the nature of the jobs that we're quantifying. So now we know payroll, and since we know economic activity is the sum of payroll and spending, we subtract the payroll of $84,000 from direct economic activity to get the $119,000 in direct spending. And again, this conversion ratio of 14 jobs per million, that's not the actual study conversion ratio used. This is just a simple number used for presentation purposes only. Now the last economic impact category, the impacts, the measures are calculated exactly like what we did for general aviation visitor spending. We work backwards from our direct annual economic activity to determine jobs, payroll, and spending. However, the estimates or components to identify total annual commercial visitor spending is a little bit different. It's a little bit easier to quantify because 2 of the sources we can get that are readily available. So we start with annual enplanements. As we know, only the 8 commercial service airports with commercial airline service will have commercial enplanements. So those are the number of passenger boardings per year that each airport experiences. That information comes from the FAA, and we get the percentage of visitors from U.S. DOT origin and destination data, which is based on actual ticket sales data. So the percent visitors times annual enplanements times the average spending per visitor gives us our annual commercial visitor spending. Now we don't know average spend per visitor, but similar to general aviation visitors, we use visitor surveys to identify what that average spend is per visitor. Now each of the 8 commercial service airports were asked to distribute surveys one of 2 ways, either hard copies in the terminal building or possibly through direct passenger intercept interviews done in the terminal in the waiting area pre-boarding, or possibly if the airport was able, they put the survey up on their Wi-Fi. So If a passenger is waiting for their flight and they log onto the Wi-Fi, they are then prompted to complete our survey, which asks, hey, are you a visitor? If so, what did you spend and on what? And what is the purpose of your stay? And how long were you in town? So we know all from that we can derive our commercial visitor spending average. Now the Wi-Fi survey is advantageous in that we were able to leave it up at airports for a much longer period of time and cast a wider net, get a much larger sample size. However, in general, we do get some funky outliers. People can put in funny numbers. We do have to contend with filtering out some obviously bad information. If somebody puts in $20 billion, that's not likely to have occurred, and that's not a reasonable number to incorporate into an average. On the other hand, a person-to-person interview or a paper survey in the terminal might garner a little bit more genuine response. But our sample size is much more limited because we can only do it for a shorter period of time. And as we know, most of the 8 airports, with the exception of Duluth, have only a handful of departures a day. So there's just a limited opportunity to capture visitor surveys. And of course, not everybody participates. Many people decline. But those are the 2 ways that we identify the average visitor spending. So now that we have our 3 components to this equation, annual enplanements times percent visitors times average spending per visitor, now we know our average or our total annual visitor spending associated with commercial service airline activity, which is the 5th and final category of economic impact. And similar to general aviation users, these visitors have expenditures on lodging, food, ground transportation, recreation, retail, and entertainment. So now, similar to the last 2 categories, we have to work backwards. This is to identify the direct annual economic activity. We know in our example airport, we have 100,000 enplanements, 40% of which were visitors. We're not interested in the residents who are departing via their neighborhood airport because they're not visitors. We're interested in identifying the spend that is brought to the state of Minnesota and the local economies by visitors. So 40% of the 100,000 enplanements works out to 40,000 annual commercial visitors. Our average spend per visitor is identified at $500. So 40,000 times 500 is $20 million in direct commercial visitor economic activity. Now this is where we work backwards. We know the big number. Now we need to identify employment. InPlan tells us the same ratio, 14 jobs per $1 million spent is our conversion ratio. So out of the $20 million, that results in 280 jobs. Our average payroll, which is in this example the same $28,000 for service industry type jobs, results in $7.8 million in direct payroll. Again, that's $28,000 for average payroll multiplied against the 280 direct employees. We get $7.8 million in payroll. Now we know 3 of the 4 components, and we can subtract payroll from direct annual economic activity to get direct spending, which works out to, in this case, $12.2 million. Now, everything discussed to this point was working to identify the direct impacts associated with airports. These are quantifiable things that take place on airports or as a direct result of airport activity, users of the airport. Employment, payroll, spending, annual economic activity. Now, we know that these dollars don't just stop at the airport's boundary. They as they enter the local economy, they have a ripple effect, also known as the multiplier impacts, also referred here to as indirect and induced impacts. So the study process, primarily the large majority of the work is related to identifying the direct impacts. Once we establish the direct impacts, we can use the InPlan economic input-output model which assigns multipliers to all the direct impacts to identify the total impacts. So our total impacts are direct plus indirect and induced, or multiplier. talk a little bit about some of that now. What is indirect and induced impacts? Indirect and induced are different, but always reported together. As in this study, they're reported together. As an example, as you see on your screen, we have an airport employee. This could be the airport manager, or this could be an employee of an airport business. But nonetheless, this on-airport employee spends $500 of his, takes home $500 in pay. Now, he leaves the airport, lives his life, and in this example spends $50 at the vet, $150 at the grocery, and $200 at the doctor. So this $400 in spend creates the ripple effect. Now, the multipliers that InPlan provides, of which there are hundreds specific to each industry and specific to each measure and category, the multipliers identify the ripple effect of this, and we'll give you a quick example of indirect and induced. The $50 spent at the veterinarian, induced impacts would be the portion of that $50 that goes to cover the vet's staff, the assistants and administrative staff at the vet, or the vet himself. Induced is always the added impact of additional payroll entering the economy. Now, the veterinarian and his staff, that money leaves the vet's office and they spend it themselves in the local economy in a similar manner, at the grocery, at the vet, at the, wherever. That's induced, and this keeps occurring. It ripples multiple times, each time getting a little bit smaller. Now, $50 is a small portion of money, but rippled across all of the airport employees that we started with, and across all of the merchants and places to spend money in town, it adds up to quite a big impact. Now, induced impacts, on the other hand, we'll use the same veterinarian example. A portion of that $50 spent at the vet goes towards the veterinarian covering his operating expenditures. So that could go towards paying the rent on his building, covering the utilities, the insurance, purchasing supplies from his vendors. Now, that indirect is always businesses purchasing from other businesses. So whether it's utilities going to the, payments to the utility company, that utility company pays other entities, the supplier of veterinarian supplies in the office purchases those supplies from others, some other supplier. So the ripple effect keeps occurring as the businesses keep purchasing from businesses further and further into the economy, getting a little bit smaller each time. So that's an example of the multiplier impacts, which are made up of indirect and induced, which are their own separate types of impact. But again, they're always reported together. So we identify the direct impacts, identify indirect and induced or multiplier, combine them, and we have our total annual economic impacts. So here we have just a little bit of an example that shows how the direct employment, payroll, and spending at an airport is calculated to ultimately identify the total economic impact for an airport. This could be the 4 jobs associated here. Let's pretend these are the 4 jobs from the airport management category example from a preceding slide. So the 4 direct jobs, we have a 1.87 multiplier. So that adds an additional 3.5 jobs, working out to rounded to a total of 8 jobs. Payroll similarly has its own unique set of weighted multipliers. Again, lots of multipliers are considered depending on what type of economic impact category and measure we're dealing with, but $140,000 in direct payroll ultimately results in $253,000 in total payroll. Spending, $60,000 in spending turns into $105,000. A little bit smaller of a multiplier, 1.75 in this particular case. And payroll plus spending, we start with $200,000 in economic activity on the direct side. Factor in our multipliers, ripple effect, indirect induced, whatever you want to call it. That's dollars entering the local economy, the $200,000 rippling across the local economy turns into $358,000 in total annual economic activity. So some key points to remember when you see your total economic impacts, which will be rolled out at the end of February. Your total impacts represent activity in several categories, typically 3, as many as 5. So those are airport management, business tenants, capital investment, general aviation visitor spending, and commercial visitor spending. So it's more than just who do I see working on the airport the day I was last at the airport. There's many categories involved, sources of impact. The second key point is when you see your total impact, it represents not only the direct impacts, which are quantifiable and measurable on airport or as a result of airport activity. It also includes the ripple effect as the employees and the payroll and the spending associated with each airport in each of the categories hits the economy and ripples throughout businesses. So there are many components to the big number that you ultimately see that make up your economic impact number. So what's next? Well, we want you to use your study results. They're going to be rolled out again at the end of February. We want you to have a good understanding of how to explain the results, understand what went into the process to estimate those results. Many steps are pretty straightforward. Others are a little bit more complex, but we're hopeful that this presentation will be helpful to you in understanding that process. We want airports to be able to defend their numbers and advocate for themselves and say, look, this is how much we're worth. This is our economic impact. So here's some other ways that we expect the study to be used. The credibility of the study is really enhanced when airports and airport stakeholders have a general understanding of how their economic impacts were estimated. And in general, the study concludes that all airports have a positive economic impact on the state's economy, and that economic impact is significant, as we noted on one of the first slides, with $1.6 billion in economic activity hitting the Minnesota economy as a result of airports. Not every airport is the same. Every airport has different factors making up their number, but every airport contributes in some way. So we want airports to take the initiative to share their economic impacts at the local level. This will help underscore how each airport supports its local community and vice versa. The methodology guide, which follows the flow of this PowerPoint presentation, should help provide some suggestions and guidance on how each airport can communicate its estimated annual economic impact. There's a number of documents that will be provided as a result of this study. First, we have the individual airport reports. Each airport will get their own unique individual airport report, which summarizes the economic impact by measure and category. On your screen, it should be the small bottom right brochure-looking thing you see. There's a map of your airport and a one-year sample of aircraft operations from an FAA database that we have access to. There should also be a short little write-up about your airport, which the MnDOT aeronautics staff has worked very hard to make sure they accurately reflect the qualitative benefits of your airport. What does your airport provide that we aren't quantifying in our economic impact estimate? Just a nice little story, hopefully, about your airport. We also produce a legislative report for every Minnesota legislative district that associates a grouping of airports with each legislative district. Now, the district boundary is not hard and fast, whereas an airport that is close to a legislative district is not included. There is some overlap where an airport will be counted in multiple legislative districts, but ultimately the goal here is to associate the economic impacts for the airports that fall within or close to each legislative district to that district. So the legislators or the representatives associated with those districts can quickly assess, identify, and hopefully advocate for the airports and really have an aha moment and say, wow, these airports in my district are really are important and have an economic impact that's worth noting and supporting. We also produce a fact sheet, which is kind of a quick glance, fun facts for the study for economic impacts and a little bit of methodology and background on the study. But it should be just a one-page thing, that fact sheet that gives you the quick and dirty of the economic impact study. The methodology guide, the bottom left cover that you see, again, largely follows the flow of this PowerPoint presentation. It is a quick way to understand the assumptions and measures and categories that make up each airport's economic impact. If you need to understand in a greater depth or detail the full methodology, the executive summary or the technical report document is a much more voluminous document that goes into greater detail on all of the methodology we have touched on here briefly today. The technical report also provides impacts by each direct, induced, indirect, and total. Each measure and each category and source of the impact is provided by each airport. And as mentioned, the total impact at the end also mentions the Metropolitan Airports Commission impacts, so you can get some perspective as to how the MnDOT state airports of 120, state study airports of 126 airports compares to the MAC airport system, and also combining those two together provides some perspective as to how impactful the entire Minnesota airport system is in terms of jobs, payroll, and economic activity. There's also a quick statewide executive summary that is 12 pages, 16 pages in length, that goes into brief detail on the process, the methodology, the categories, and each of the measures, and lists the impacts for each airport. So we really hope all of these products are useful to the airports and any stakeholder or anybody in the general public who is interested in understanding their airport and what it means to the Minnesota economy. These reports will be made available at mindot.gov/aero. We have a question slide. Any questions? No? Wonderful, thank you. Awesome. All right. Don't tell